Hey everyone, I'm Belle Reid and welcome back to another video. Today I'm taking a look at the brand new Tonverk from Elektron. Here is another sample. Tonverk is a 16-track sampler and effects workstation. It combines polyphonic multi-sampling, dynamic sound processing and modulation, and flexible mixing and routing controls in one compact instrument. If you're already familiar with Elektron's prior devices, you'll find a lot of familiar features and workflow within Tonverk. That said, there are a number of new capabilities introduced in Tonverk that aren't found in other Elektron devices, especially around how audio is routed, processed, and shaped. Now, if you've followed my channel for a while, you probably know that I'm relatively new to the Elektron world. My first introduction to Elektron devices was last year with the Digitone 2, which I really love. So Tonverk is still pretty fresh territory for me in terms of workflow. That said, I've really been enjoying exploring Tonverk as an experimental sound design tool and seeing what kinds of strange, unusual musical corners I can push it into. In this video, I'm going to share a quick overview of how Tonverk works, and then I'm going to dive into a bunch of sounds and patches that I've been creating with it over the last few weeks. This won't be a super comprehensive look at every single feature inside of Tonverk, but instead more of a look at some different experimental and creative ways of using it to create and to process sound. If you want to pick a Tonverk up for yourself, I've dropped an affiliate link down in the description below this video. All right, so let's start off with a quick tour of Tonverk. Tonverk is organized into 16 tracks. Tracks 1 through 8 are instrument tracks, which can each act as a sampler or a MIDI control source for external gear. Tracks 9 through 12 are bus tracks, designed for routing and processing groups of sounds. Tracks 13 through 15 work as send effects paths, giving you independent control over how much of each track is fed into different effects. And track 16 is the mix track, where you can arrange your final mix for all tracks. Like Elektron's other devices, Tonverk has a super powerful sequencer. It also has a built-in arpeggiator, song mode, and chord mode. While these features are awesome, I'm not going to go deep into how they work in this video, because I want to focus primarily on some of the new things that Tonverk brings to the table. All right, so sound within Tonverk is based primarily around sampling. So let's get into some specifics around how that works. There are tons of samples that come preloaded onto Tonverk, but for me personally, the strength of an instrument like this one is in its ability to easily create and process your own samples from scratch. You can load samples directly from the SD card, transfer them over USB, or record right into Tonverk using the quarter-inch inputs or over USB audio. I think it's worth highlighting that the presence of USB audio here means that you can stream audio directly from your computer, phone, or tablet via USB-C, which makes it super easy to integrate Tonverk into other workflows. Once you've captured some sound, you can edit, trim, and save it into Tonverk's memory for use in your projects. We'll take a look at some demos of this in just a minute. There are 3 source machines inside of Tonverk: single player, multiplayer, and subtracks. Single player is a straightforward sample player with up to 8 voice polyphony. You can record or load in a single sample and then instantly play it back polyphonically. So for example, here is a simple sample of my voice. There are controls for the sample behavior, allowing you to narrow in on a specific region of the sample, or to change the playback speed, direction, and whether the sample is in one-shot or looping mode. Here is another sample.
Here is another sample. Here is another sample. Here is another sample.
Here is another sample of my
Here is another
sample of my Something I've really been loving about this is simply the ability to turn any of my synthesizers into a very portable, MIDI controllable polyphonic instrument. So for example, here in this demo, I have a super simple patch set up on my Buchla 200E system, and I'm going to sample that into Tonverk, and that will allow me to turn this simple patch into a layered polyphonic instrument. And here is that same sample layered and sequenced using Tonverk. The multiplayer source machine is similar to single player, but it allows for multi-sampled instruments. This means that you can create samples with multiple different velocity layers to emulate more realistic sounding expression and timbral variation. A classic use case of multi-sampling would be sampling an acoustic instrument like a piano or a violin at multiple different dynamics, for example, soft, medium, and loud, so that when you play the samples back, the sound naturally shifts in tone and intensity depending on how hard you hit the keys. Likewise, with multi-sampling, you can use different samples for different pitches, allowing a more natural translation of the sound as you go up and down the instrument's pitch range. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, this process can be super labor intensive, but Tonverk has a really cool feature called auto sampling, which allows you to hook up an external MIDI instrument, set a pitch range and interval spacing for samples within that pitch range and a number of velocity layers, and then Tonverk will automatically play, record, and organize those samples for you. So now that I've finished the multi-sampling process, I can trigger different samples based on the velocity of my playing. So in the example we just heard, I used a pretty typical mapping for the MIDI velocity data. As the velocity value gets higher, the sound gets louder. But on the Buchla and on so many synthesizers, it's pretty easy to use the velocity data to impact other aspects of the sound. So for example, you could use the velocity data to make a sound brighter, or to impact the speed of a modulation source, and so on. But what I have found is super fun is to use this multi-sampling process in an even more experimental way. So for example, here in this patch, I ran the auto-sampling process again, and instead of just using the velocity to impact the sound's timbre, I also used the trigger output from my MIDI to CV converter to generate several new random voltages with each new note. Ultimately, what this did was it randomized a whole bunch of parameters so that each new note triggered from Tonverk during the auto-sampling process has a very different pitch and timbre. What I end up with here is a kind of random multi-dimensional array of samples that can be selected based on incoming MIDI pitch and velocity information. This can be really fun using a normal external controller like the keystep, as we've seen, but the internal sequencer on Tonverk also has some interesting tricks for taking advantage of the multi-sampling's velocity sensitivity. Perhaps the most obvious is using parameter locks to set different velocity values for every note in a sequence. You can also use this transform section. So this allows you to apply programmatic changes to velocity, which can be really fun. So for example, you can randomize the velocity of all the trigs in a sequence. Or you could make it such that the velocity ramps up for each successive trig. Or you could make it ramp down instead. And of course, you can apply different transformations to different tracks, making things even more interesting. Of course, any external method of applying variable velocity control can be super interesting as well. For instance, you could easily set up a max patch to send random notes or random velocities over to Tonverk. So here's an example of that. Or you could use a more unusual type of controller. Here, for instance, I'm using a Buchla Thunder, which allows you to specify some simple automated behaviors, including algorithmic changes to velocity from the device itself. The last source machine in Tonverk is called Subtracks. This lets you load up to 8 mono or stereo samples into one track, and then to create subsequences on each track. So for example, instead of using all 8 tracks to create a drum sequence, you could use Subtracks to load a bunch of drum samples onto a single track, create a sequence with them, and then you'd still have 7 additional open tracks left for other sounds. Another really big part of Tonverk is its effects processing workflow. Each audio track on Tonverk runs through a filter and an amplifier, each with dedicated envelopes, as well as 2 optional insert effects. There are a lot of great effects, but my personal favorite has been the degrader effect, which can be used to introduce several types of digital errors or artifacts to the sound. It has a really cool audio dropout and glitching effect, which I've been using a lot. also worth noting that any of the effects that you apply, as well as your samples themselves, can all be modulated using Tonverk's modulation structure. Each track has 2 dedicated FX LFOs, which can lead to some really complex and really interesting sounds. What's also really exciting is that external audio inputs can be routed through Tonverk for live processing and manipulation. So you can plug a synth or a microphone in and use Tonverk purely as a multi-effects processor. So in order to do this, you go to the source page on the mix track, and then you can decide where to route the external inputs. You can route them either to any of the first 8 tracks or directly to one of the bus tracks, which is what I'm doing here. And from there, you can apply effects and process things live. In addition to the FX inserts on each track, Tonverk also has pretty flexible audio routing capabilities. Instead of sending everything to the main mix, you can group tracks through bus tracks, which gives you level control over multiple sounds at once, and opens up another pair of effect slots for shared processing. So for example, you could glue a set of drum tracks together with compression, or send several voices through the same distortion chain. Or, of course, you could always route a single track to a bus just for the sake of doing even more complex or layered effect processing. On top of that, you also have the send tracks, which act as dedicated effect sends. These give you precise control over how much of each sound is blended into shared effects. Send levels can also be modulated, which is pretty awesome, allowing you to dynamically alter how sounds are being processed. So, for example, in this patch, I'm running the zero coast into track 1, and I am modulating the send levels from track 1 over to multiple different effects. And finally, all of this comes together at the mix track, where you can apply one last global effect to shape the entire sound before it hits the outputs. All right, awesome. So that covers a few of the different ways that I've been enjoying using Tonverk over the last little while. The sequencing capabilities within this instrument are a lot of fun, but I think for me personally, this instrument really shines when you connect an external MIDI controller to play it expressively. The auto sampler feature is definitely one of my favorite aspects of this instrument because of how easy it makes the process of turning any synth that you have into a MIDI controllable polyphonic instrument. I am definitely still getting to know Tonverk, but I can tell from my initial experiments that it will continue to be a go-to for me in my studio, both in terms of sample mangling and for effects processing. If you're looking for an amazing community of people who are passionate about things like experimental sound design, synthesizers, and electronic music, or if you're interested in things like behind-the-scenes content and unreleased music, then I would love to invite you to check out and to join my Patreon community. You can learn more and get yourself signed up by going to patreon.com/Sarah Belle Reid. All right, that's it for this one. As always, thank you so much for watching and for listening, and I'll see you next time. Oh.